Chapter 6, Part 3 of Melmoth the Wanderer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kendra Lee Oberhauser, Berkeley, California. KendraLeeOberhauser.com. Melmoth the Wanderer by Charles Robert Maturin. Chapter 6, Part 3. I awoke one night and saw my cell in flames. I started up in horror, but shrank back on perceiving myself surrounded by demons, who, clothed in fire, were breathing forth clouds of it around me. Desperate with horror, I rushed against the wall and found what I touched was cold. My recollection returned, and I comprehended that these were hideous figures scrawled in phosphorus to terrify me. I then returned to my bed, and as the daylight approached, observed these figures gradually decline. In the morning, I took a desperate resolution of forcing my way to the superior and speaking to him. I felt my reason might be destroyed amid the horrors they were surrounding me with. It was noon before I could work myself up to execute this resolution. I knocked at his cell, and when his door was opened, he exhibited the same horror as my former intrusion, but I was not to be repelled. "My father, I require you to hear me, nor will I quit this spot till you do so." "Speak." "They famish me. I am not allowed food to support nature." "Do you deserve it?" "Whether I do or not, neither the laws of God or man have yet condemned me to die of hunger, and if you do, you commit murder." "Have you anything else to complain of?" "Everything. I am not allowed to enter the church. I am forbid to pray. They have stripped my cell of crucifix, rosary, and the vessel for holy water. It is impossible for me to perform my devotions, even alone." "Your devotions!" "My father, though I am not a monk, may I not still be a Christian?" "In renouncing your vows, you have abjured your claim to either character." "But I am still a human being, and as such. But I appeal not to your humanity. I call on your authority for protection. Last night, my cell was covered with representations of fiends. I awoke in the midst of flames and spectres." "So you will at the last day." "My punishment will then be enough. It need not commence already." "These are the phantoms of your conscience." "My father, if you will deign to examine my cell, you will find the traces of phosphorus on the walls." "I examine your cell? I enter it?" "Am I then to expect no redress?" "Interpose your authority for the sake of the house over which you preside. Remember that, when my appeal becomes public, all these circumstances will become so too, and you are to judge what degree of credit they will attach to the community." "Retire." I did so, and found my application attended to, at least with regard to food, but my cell still remained in the same dismantled state, and I continued under the same desolating interdiction from all communion, religious or social. I assure you with truth that so horrible was this amputation from life to me, that I have walked hours in the cloister and the passages to place myself in the way of the monks, who, I knew, as they passed, would bestow on me some malediction or reproachful epithet. Even this was better than the withering silence which surrounded me. I began almost to receive it as a customary salutation, and always returned it with a benediction. In a fortnight, my appeal was to be decided on. This was a circumstance I was kept in ignorance of, but the superior had received notification of it, and this precipitated his resolution to deprive me of the benefit of its eventual success by one of the most horrible schemes that ever entered the human, I retract the expression, the monastic heart. I received an indistinct intimation of it the very night after my application to the Superior. But had I been apprised, from the first, of the whole extent and bearings of their purpose, what resources could I have employed against it? That evening I had gone into the garden. My heart felt unusually oppressed. Its thick, troubled beatings seemed like the vibrations of a timepiece as it measures our approach to some hour of sorrow. It was twilight, the garden was empty, and kneeling on the ground in the open air, the only oratory they had left me, I attempted to pray. The attempt was in vain. I ceased to articulate sounds that had no meaning, and, overcome by a heaviness of mind and body inexpressible, I fell on the ground and remained extended on my face, torpid, but not senseless. 2 figures passed, without perceiving me. They were in earnest conversation. One of them said, "More vigorous measures must be adopted. You are to blame and delay them so long. You will be answerable for the disgrace of the whole community if you persist in this foolish lenity." "But his resolution remains unbroken," said the Superior, for it was he. "It will not be proof against the measure I have proposed." "He is in your hands, then, but remember I will not be accountable for." They were by this time out of hearing. I was less terrified than you will believe by what I had heard. Those who have suffered much are always ready to exclaim, with the unfortunate agag, "Surely the bitterness of death is past." They know not that this is the very moment when the sword is unsheathed to hew them in pieces. That night I had not been long asleep when I was awoke by a singular noise in my cell. I started up and listened. I thought I heard someone hurry away barefooted. I knew I had no lock to my door and could not prevent the intrusion of anyone into my cell who pleased to visit it. But still, I believed the discipline of the convent too strict to allow of this. I composed myself again, but was hardly asleep when I was again awoke by something that touched me. I started up again. A soft voice near me said in whispers, "Compose yourself. I am your friend." My friend? Have I one? But why visit me at this hour? It is the only hour at which I am permitted to visit you. But who are you, then? One whom these walls can never exclude. One to whom, if you devote yourself, you may expect services beyond the power of man. There was something frightful in these words. I cried out, "Is it the enemy of the souls that is tempting me?" As I uttered these words, a monk rushed in from the passage, where he had been evidently waiting, for his dress was on. He exclaimed, "What is the matter? You have alarmed me by your cries. You pronounce the name of the infernal spirit. What have you seen? What is it you fear?" I recovered myself and said, "I have seen or heard nothing extraordinary. I have had frightful dreams, that is all." "Ah, Brother St. Joseph, no wonder, after passing such days, my nights should be disturbed." The monk retired, and the next day passed as usual, but at night the same whispering sounds awoke me again. The preceding night, these sounds had only startled me, they now alarmed me. In the darkness of night, and the solitude of my cell, this repeated visitation overcame my spirits. I became almost to admit the idea that I was exposed to the assaults of the enemy of man. I repeated a prayer, but the whisper, which seemed close to my ear, still continued. It said, "Listen, listen to me and be happy. Renounce your vows, place yourself under my protection, and you shall have no cause to complain of the exchange. Rise from your bed, trample on the crucifix which you will find at the foot of it, spit on the picture of the Virgin that lies beside it, and—" At these words I could not suppress a cry of horror. The voice ceased in a moment, and the same monk, who occupied the cell next to mine, rushed in with the same exclamations as on the preceding night. and as he entered my cell, the light in his hand shewed a crucifix and a picture of the Blessed Virgin, placed at the foot of my bed. I had sprung up when the monk entered my cell. I saw them, and recognized them to be the very crucifix and picture of the Virgin which had been taken from my cell. All the hypocritical outcries of the monk at the disturbance I had caused him could not efface the impression which this slight circumstance made on me. I believed, and not without reason, that they had been left there by the hands of some human tempter. I started, awake to this horrible imposition, and required the monk to leave my cell. He demanded, with a frightful paleness in his looks, why I had again disturbed him, said it was impossible to obtain repose while such noises were occurring in my cell, and finally, stumbling over the crucifix and picture, demanded how they came there. I answered, "You know best." "How then do you accuse me of compact with the infernal demon? By what means could these have been brought to your cell?" "By the very hands that removed them," I answered, and these words appeared to produce an effect on him for a moment, but he retired, declaring that if the nightly disturbance in my cell continued, he must present it to the superior. I answered, the disturbance did not proceed from me, but I trembled for the following night. I had reason to tremble. That night, before I lay down, I repeated prayer after prayer, the terrors of my excommunication pressing heavy on my soul. I also repeated the prayers against possession or temptation by the evil spirit. These I was compelled to utter from memory, for I have told you that they had not left a book in my cell. In repeating these prayers, which were very long and somewhat verbose, I at last fell asleep. That sleep was not to continue long. I was again addressed by the voice that whispered close to my bed. The moment I heard it, I rose without fear. I crept around my cell with my hands extended and my feet bare. I could feel nothing but the empty walls. Not a single object, tangible or visible, could I encounter. I lay down again, and had hardly begun the prayer with which I tried to fortify myself, when the same sounds were repeated close to my ear, without the possibility either of my discovering from whence they proceeded, or preventing their reaching me. Thus I was completely deprived of sleep, and if I dozed for a moment, the same terrible sounds were re-echoed in my dreams. I became feverish from want of rest. The night was passed in waiting for these sounds, or listening to them, and the day in wild conjectures or fearful anticipations. I felt a mixture of terror and impatience inconceivable at the approach of night. I had a consciousness of imposture the whole time, but this gave me no consolation, for there is a point to which human malice and mischief may be carried that would baffle those of a demon. Every night the persecution was renewed, and every night it became more terrible. At times the voice would suggest to me the most unutterable impurities. At another, blasphemies that would make a demon shudder. Then it would applaud me in a tone of derision, and assure me of the final success of my appeal, then change to the most appalling menaces. The wretched sleep I obtained during the intervals of this visitation was anything but refreshing. I would awake in a cold perspiration, catching at the bed furniture, and repeating in an inarticulate voice the last sounds that had rung in my closing ears. I would start up and see the bed surrounded by monks, who assured me they had been disturbed by my cries, that they had hurried in terror to my cell. Then they would cast looks of fear and consternation on each other and on me, say, "Something extraordinary is the matter, something presses on your mind that you will not disburden it of." They implored me, in the most awful names, and for the interest of my salvation, to disclose the cause of these extraordinary visitations. At these words, however agitated before, I always became calm. I said, "Nothing is the matter. Why do you intrude into my cell?" They shook their heads, and affected to retire slowly and reluctantly, as if from pity of my dreadful situation, while I repeated, "Ah, brother Justin! Ah, brother Clement! I see you, I understand you. Remember, there is a God in heaven." One night I lay for a considerable time without hearing any sound. I fell asleep, but was soon awoke by an extraordinary light. I sat up in my bed, and beheld displayed before me the Mother of God in all the glorious and irradiated incarnation of beatitude. She hovered, rather than stood, in an atmosphere of light at the foot of my bed, and held a crucifix in her hand, while she appeared to invite me, with a benign action, to kiss the 5 mysterious wounds. For a moment, I almost believed in the actual presence of this glorious visitor. But then just the voice was heard, louder than ever. "Spurn them, spit on them, you are mine, and I claim this homage from my vassal." At these words, the figure disappeared instantly, and the voice was renewing its whispers, but they were repeated to an insensible ear, for I fell into a swoon. I could easily distinguish between this state and sleep by the deadly sickness, the cold sweats, and the horrid sense of evanition that preceded it, and by the gasping, sobbing, choking efforts that attended my recovery. In the meantime, the whole community carried on and even aggravated the terrible delusion, which, while it was my torment to detect, it was my greater to be the victim of. When art assumes the omnipotence of reality, when we feel we suffer as much from an illusion as from truth, our sufferings lose all dignity and all consolation. We turn demons against ourselves, and laugh at what we are writhing under. All day long I was exposed to the stare of horror, the shudder of suspicion, and, worst of all, the hastily averted glance of hypocritical commiseration that dropped its pitying ray on me for a moment, and was then instantly raised to heaven, as if to implore forgiveness for the involuntary crime of compassionating one whom God had renounced. When I encountered any of them in the garden, they would strike into another walk, and cross themselves in my sight. If I met them in the passages of the convent, they drew their garments close, turned their faces to the wall, and told their beads as I went by. If I ventured to dip my hands in the holy water that stood at the door of the church, it was thrown out before my face. Certain extraordinary precautions were adopted by the whole community against the power of the evil one. Forms of exorcism were distributed, and additional prayers were used in the service of matins and vespers. A report was industriously diffused that Satan was permitted to visit a favored and devoted servant of his in the convent, and that all the brethren might expect the redoubled malice of his assaults. The effect of this on the young boarders was indescribable. They flew with the speed of lightning from me whenever they saw me. If accident forced us to be near each other for a moment, they were armed with holy water, which they flung at me in pailfuls, and when that failed, what cries, what convulsions of terror! They knelt, they screamed, they shut their eyes, they cried, "Satan, have mercy on me, do not fix your infernal talons on me, take your victim," and they mentioned my name. The terror that I inspired, I at last began to feel. I began to believe myself, I know not what, whatever they thought me. This is a dreadful state of mind, but one impossible to avoid. In some circumstances, where the whole world is against us, we begin to take part against ourselves, to avoid the withering sensation of being alone on our own side. Such was my appearance too, my flushed and haggard look, my torn dress, my unequal gait, my constant internal muttering, and my complete isolation from the habits of the house, that it was no wonder I should justify, by my exterior, all of horrible and awful that might be supposed passing in my mind. Such an impression I must have made on the minds of the younger members. They had been taught to hate me, but their hatred was now combined with fear, and such a union is the most terrible amid all the complications of human passion. Desolate as my cell was, I retired to it early, as I was excluded from the exercises of the community. The bell for vespers would ring. I would hear the steps of those who were hastening to join in the service of God, and tedious as that service had once appeared to me, I would now have given worlds to be permitted to join it, as a defense against that horrible midnight mass of Satan that I was awaiting to be summoned to. I knelt, however, in my cell, and repeated what prayers I could recollect, while every toll of the bell struck on my heart, and the chaunt of the choir from below sounded like a repulsive echo to an answer which my fears had already anticipated from heaven. One evening that I still continued to pray, and audibly, as the monks passed my cell, they said, "Do you presume to pray? Die, desperate wretch! Die and be damned! Precipitate yourself into the infernal gulf at once. No longer desecrate these walls by your presence." At these words, I only redoubled my prayers, but this gave greater offense, for the churchmen could not bear to hear prayers uttered in a form different from their own. The cry of a solitary individual to God sounds like profanation in their ears. They ask, why do they not employ our form? How dare they hope to be heard? Alas! Is it forms, then, that God regards? Or is it not rather the prayer of the heart which alone reaches him, and prospers in its petition? As they called out, passing my cell, "Perish, impious wretch, perish! God will not hear you," I answered them on my knees with blessings. Which of us had the spirit of prayer? That night was one of trial I could no longer support. My frame was exhausted, my mind excited, and, owing to our frail nature, this battle of the senses and soul is never long carried on without the worst side remaining conqueror. I was no sooner laid down than the voice began to whisper. I began to pray, but my head swam round, my eyes flashed fire, almost tangible. My cell appeared in flames. Recollect my frame worn out with famine, my mind worn out with persecution. I struggled with what I was conscious was delirium, but this consciousness aggravated its horror. It is better to be mad at once than to believe that all the world is sworn to think and make you be so, in spite of your own consciousness of your sanity. The whispers this night were so horrible, so full of ineffable abominations, I cannot think of them, that they maddened my very ear. My senses seemed deranged, along with my intellect. I will give you an instance, it is but a slight one, of the horrors which— Here the Spaniard whispered, "Melmoth." The hearer shuddered, and the Spaniard went on in an agitated tone. I could bear it no longer. I sprung from my bed. I ran through the gallery like a maniac, knocking at the doors of the cells and exclaiming, "Brother such a one, pray for me, I beseech you." I roused the whole convent. Then I flew down to the church. It was open, and I rushed in. I ran up the aisle. I precipitated myself before the altar. I embraced the images. I clung to the crucifix with loud and reiterated supplications. The monks, awakened by my outcries, or perhaps on the watch for them, descended in a body to the church, but, perceiving I was there, they would not enter. They remained at the doors, with lights in their hands, gazing on me. It was a singular contrast between me, hurrying around the church almost in the dark, for there were but few lamps burning dimly, and the group at the door, whose expression of horror was strongly marked by the light, which appeared to have deserted me to concentrate itself among them. The most impartial person on earth might have supposed me deranged, or possessed, or both, from the state in which they saw me. Heaven knows, too, what construction might have been put on my wild actions, which the surrounding darkness exaggerated and distorted, or on the prayers which I uttered, as I included in them the horrors of the temptation against which I implored protection. Exhausted at length, I fell to the ground, and remained there, without the power of moving, but able to hear and observe everything that passed. I heard them debate whether they should leave me there or not till the superior commanded them to remove that abomination from the sanctuary. And such was the terror of me into which they had acted themselves, that he had had to repeat his orders before he could procure obedience to them. They approached me at last, with the same caution that they would an infected corse, and dragged me out by the habit, leaving me on the paved floor before the door of the church. They then retired, and in this state I actually fell asleep, and continued so till I was awoke by the bell for matins. I recollected myself, and attempted to rise, but my having slept on a damp floor, when in a fever from terror and excitement, had so cramped my limbs, that I could not accomplish this without the most exquisite pain. As the community passed in to matins, I could not suppress a few cries of pain. They must have seen what was the matter, but not one of them offered me assistance, nor did I dare to implore it. By slow and painful efforts I at last reached my cell, but, shuddering at the sight of the bed, I threw myself on the floor for repose. I was aware that some notice must be taken of a circumstance so extraordinary, that such a subversion of the order and tranquillity of a convent would force an inquiry, even if the object was less remarkable. But I had a sad foreboding, for suffering makes us full of presages, that this inquiry, however conducted, would terminate unfavorably to me. I was the Jonah of the vessel. Let the storm blow from what point it would, I felt the lot was to fall on me. About noon, I was summoned to the apartment of the superior. I went, but not as at former times, with a mixture of supplication and remonstrance on my lips, with hope and fear in my heart, in a fever of excitement or of terror. I went sullen, squalid, listless, reckless, my physical strength borne down by fatigue and want of sleep, my mental by persecution, incessant and insupportable. I went no longer shrinking from and deprecating their worst, but defying, almost desiring it, in the terrible and indefinite curiosity of despair. The apartment was full of monks. The superior stood among them, while they formed a semicircle at a respectable distance from him. I must have presented a miserable contrast to these men, arrayed against me in their pride of power, their long and not ungraceful habits, giving their figures an air of solemnity, perhaps more imposing than splendor, while I stood opposed to them, ragged, meagre, livid, and obdurate, the very personification of an evil spirit summoned before the angels of judgment. The superior addressed me in a long discourse, in which he but slightly touched on the scandal given by the attempt to repeal my vows. He also suppressed any allusion to the circumstance which was known to every one in the convent but myself, that my appeal would be decided on in a few days. But he adverted in terms that, in spite of my consciousness that they were hollow, made me shudder to the horror and consternation diffused through the convent by my late tremendous visitation, as he called it. "Satan hath desired to have you," he said, "because you have put yourself within his power by your impious reclamation of your vows. You are the Judas among the brethren, a branded Cain amid a primitive family, a scapegoat that struggles to burst from the hands of the congregation into the wilderness. The horrors that your presence is hourly heaping on us here are not only intolerable to the discipline of a religious house, but to the peace of a civilized society. There is not a monk who can sleep within 3 cells of you. You disturb them by the most horrible cries. You exclaim that the infernal spirit is perpetually beside your bed, that he is whispering in your ears. You fly from cell to cell, supplicating the prayers of the brethren. Your shrieks disturb the holy sleep of the community, that sleep which they snap only in the intervals of devotion. All order is broken, all discipline subverted, while you remain among us. The imaginations of the younger members are at once polluted and inflamed by the idea of the infernal and impure orgies which the demon celebrates in your cell, and of which we know not whether your cries, which all can hear, announce triumph in or remorse for. You rush at midnight into the church, deface the images, revile the crucifix, spurn at the altar. And when the whole community is forced, by this unparalleled atrocity of blasphemy, to drag you from the spot you are desecrating, you disturb, by your cries, those who are passing to the service of God. In a word, your howls, your distortions, your demoniac language, habits, and gestures have but too well justified the suspicion entertained when you first entered the convent. You were abominable from your very birth. You were the offspring of sin. You are conscious of it. Amid the livid paleness, that horrible, unnatural white that discolors your very lips, I see a tinge like crimson burning on your cheek at the mention of it. The demon who is presiding at your natal hour, the demon of impurity and anti-monasticism, pursues you in the very walls of a convent. The Almighty, in my voice, bids you begone, depart, and trouble us no more. Stop, he added, as he saw I was obeying his directions literally. Hold, the interests of religion and of the community have required that I should take particular notice of the extraordinary circumstances that have haunted your unhallowed presence within these walls. In a short time, you may expect a visit from the bishop. Prepare yourself for it as you may. I considered these as the final words addressed to me, and was about to retire when I was recalled. I was desired to utter some words, which everyone was eager to put into my mouth, of expostulation, of remonstrance, of supplication. I resisted them all as steadily as if I had known, which I did not, that the bishop had himself instituted the examination into the deranged state of the convent, and that instead of the superior inviting the bishop to examine into the cause of the disturbance in his convent, the very last step he would have taken, the bishop, a man whose character will shortly be developed, had been apprised of the scandal of the convent, and had determined to take the matter into his own hands. Sunk in solitude and persecution, I knew not that all Madrid was on fire, that the bishop had determined to be no longer a passive hearer of the extraordinary scenes reported to pass in the convent. That, in a word, my exorcism and my appeal were quivering in alternate scales, and that the superior himself doubted which way the scale might incline. All this I was ignorant of, for no one dared to tell it to me. I therefore was about to retire, without uttering a word in answer to the many whispered speeches, to humble myself to the superior, to implore his intercession with the bishop to suspend this disgraceful examination that threatened us all. I broke from them as they surrounded me, and standing calm and sullen at the door, I threw a retorting look at them and said, God forgive you all, and grant you such an acquittal at his judgment seat, as I hesitate not to claim at that of the bishop visitant. These words, though uttered by a ragged demoniac, as they thought me, made them tremble. Truth is rarely heard in convents, and therefore its language is equally emphatical and portentous. End of chapter 6, part 3. Recording by Kendra Lee Oberhauser, Berkeley, California.